Oh, are we on? All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for showing up for, again, a rainy drenched Fridays with Rocky here, obviously sponsored by the Charlotte Mecklenburg Public Library. I'm very excited about today's guest and today's topic today. Legal services for the poor is very important to me and important to my own professional journey. Obviously, you know me as the nonprofit attorney that comes to the library and discusses, not topics of nonprofit law. But very early in my career, for 9 years, I had the privilege of serving as a legal services attorney in North Central Florida, where I was stationed at programs in Gainesville, Florida, and in Tallahassee, Florida, where I sort of learned the craft of being a lawyer. And so today, joining us is someone who has not only talked the talk, but has walked the walk when it comes to the idea of legal services, of being a true advocate to serving those who cannot afford access to justice. And this is what this is all about. And so joining us today, of course, is Ken Schorr, who is wrapping up an incredible career as a legal services advocate. I always like to crib a question from a good friend of our show, Pat McDowell, who has his own podcast called The Path to Nonprofit Leadership. And he likes to ask his guests, because he asked me one time, he always says, what was your path to nonprofit leadership? But today, obviously, you are a nonprofit leader, and we can obviously talk about that aspect of your job. But I think it'd be great for the audience to know a little bit about you, Ken, and tell us a little bit about your sort of background, your story, and how did you find the calling? When did the calling come to you to become a legal services attorney and find yourself in Charlotte, North Carolina, building this program?
Well, I don't know how far back you want to go.
It's up to you, Ken.
I grew up in a family of advocates. My grandparents were all immigrants from Eastern Europe. My mother's family through Argentina. She actually was born in Eastern Europe and grew up in Argentina. My father grew up with a single mother who was an immigrant in the Bronx. And that was what the family did. My father was a social worker, and my mother was a computer programmer, but was a civil rights activist, and so we were raised to do. I, as a young adult, was an environmental activist and actually went to law school to do environmental law, and was somewhat radicalized by law school and by how much the law school curriculum at my law school, and I think in many, were organized around serving corporations and wealthy people.
It hasn't changed.
Well, I think it's changed some to that degree. And after law school, searching for something that fit for me, I wound up in Arkansas working with a community organization, working with neighborhood groups in low-income neighborhoods. And from there, spent a few years working with labor unions, representing small labor unions in small towns in Arkansas and in surrounding states, and doing civil rights litigation, employment discrimination litigation. I'm restless. When I went to law school, I knew that each state had its own bar licensing and that was a huge barrier to movement, but I was determined that I wanted to see different parts of the country, and I wasn't going to let that stop me. So I went to Arizona to be a litigation supervisor in a legal services program. And what particularly attracted me about that was that Arizona had both a conventional poverty law program, but also had a large Native American population. Phoenix has the largest Native American population of any city in the country. and also a large farm worker population. This was back in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Before farm workers were sort of people, there was a broad public understanding of farm workers. And it was just fascinating to me to get to work with the issues that those groups faced in contemporary society. You asked about my path to leadership. I was a litigation director, and our director decided to leave. And the board said, we need somebody on staff to be interim director who isn't interested in being permanent director. And I didn't particularly want to do it, but I looked at my colleagues and I thought, if any of them are selected, it'll be awful. And so I volunteered reluctantly to be interim director. And it took the board almost a year to hire a new director, by which time I thought, well, I can do this. This is
So that's interesting. So you were the director of litigation, and so your path into becoming senior management of a nonprofit was more by just there was a vacancy, and that you just felt compelled to just throw your hat in the ring in a sense.
Well, I was an active trial lawyer, and I was working with community organizations and labor unions, and the opportunity, and I was still pretty young, but the opportunity to sort of train younger lawyers just appealed to me as a new way to use skills, and so that was what took me there. And what took me to the director position was this agency has to run. And there's going to be an interim director, and I don't see who else I think could do it well. And then it's, running a nonprofit is a hugely demanding, challenging, but also satisfying. I mean, it can be enormously frustrating, given limited resources and demands on the agency. But if you can make it work, I found it enormously satisfying.
Can we have a lot of folks who come on who come in our audience who are budding founders of nonprofits? They want to start their own nonprofit. They want to be a director. Obviously, I've talked about my experience before, my learning curve, but during those early days, or like maybe early couple of years, what were some of the things that you picked up that you maybe could impart to some of the folks in our audience who might be interested in really going further in a nonprofit sort of executive role?
Well, to be clear, I didn't start the agencies that I worked for. I've been involved in starting agencies as a volunteer, as a board member, and it's really hard. I mean, there's but go for it. I don't. The world needs to be fixed, and there are lots of different opportunities to contribute to that. And for me, it's been a great privilege to be in that business, to have the opportunity to work in community.
So how did you find your way to Charlotte? So you were interim director in Arizona. I assume they made you a permanent director in Arizona.
No,
is that correct?
They did not.
Oh.
They hired a director.
Okay.
And at which point I said, well, I really kind of like this challenge of being director. So I looked around and I applied for a position and got hired to be the director in Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
And I moved to Texas.
All right.
It was an organization with an incredibly volatile history. It had been in the middle of big civil rights fights. The Legal Services Agency not only represented poor people in poverty law cases, but they handled the school desegregation case.
Okay.
And handled the single member districting of the city council case. So they were in the middle of hugely controversial work. And so they had a lot of turnovers in executive directors. I think when I started, the agency was 17 years old and had 11 directors.
Wow, that's a lot of turnover.
And I was warned, but I was also sort of oblivious.
Mm.
And I ran that agency for almost 5 years.
Okay.
And I came to Charlotte for personal reasons. I came here to get married.
That's a good reason.
Right. Well,
that's a good reason.
And when I came, the legal services office here was looking for an executive director, and I gave a lot of thought whether I want to keep doing it or not, and applied, and that was almost 34 years ago.
Wow, 34. So when you arrive, because I love the kind of so it sounds like, and this is why I think I really want to use this episode to kind of get into your backstory, to really kind of talk about like an incredible career in the law. I don't think it's just that somebody who comes out of law school, because like you said, in law school there are pressure, and it has definitely changed somewhat because curriculums have become a little more open to to public interest work, to other things. But at that time when you were in law school, I think that's an incredible choice that many of you and the folks who had mentored me when I was in legal services made, to kind of not go the corporate route, but to actually, soldier with those who are who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who have, lack of resources, but they still have legal rights. And I think that's, I think that's an incredible statement, and again, I think this community, it's good to know your backstory, and then how it leads you into Charlotte, into and now at the time, was it called Legal Services Southern Piedmont, or was it Legal Aid in North Carolina? What was the name of the organization when you arrived?
When I started, it was Legal Services of Southern Piedmont. So in the early 60s, when President Johnson started the war on poverty, created the Office of Economic Opportunity, one of the original OEO programs was the Legal Services Program. And it was conceived as something different than traditional legal aid, that it was to not only represent individual low-income people in the legal disputes that they had, but was also to be counsel to the low-income community to help address systemic problems that kept people poor. And it was fundamentally conceived as an anti-poverty agency.
Gotcha. So that's go ahead.
And OEO went around the country helping start legal services programs. And so in 1967, the Charlotte Area Fund and the Mecklenburg County Bar appointed a board of 2/3 lawyers and 1/3 low-income people. And OEO gave them a grant to start what was then called the Legal Aid Society of Mecklenburg County. And in 1979, it became a regional 5-county program and changed its name to Legal Services Southern Piedmont.
Okay. I think that's a real, at least as far as the evolution of sort of access to justice and legal services to the poor is, I think for general audience is that, I think when I think of legal aid, it's just sort of like, oh, I get an attorney who's not going to charge me money, kind of like a standard, like the Mecklenburg Bar has like a lawyer referral service, and sometimes they can get, pro bono, kind of like a one-off. But legal service is fundamentally different. I think this is great is that it's truly at root an anti-poverty program, because that's its core from its roots in the Johnson War on Poverty and the Office of Economic Opportunity. That when you meet a legal service attorney, when you meet, a legal services program, a legal aid program that has dedicated attorneys, that it is obviously access to justice, but it's clearly its core and its root is to defeat poverty. And the way to defeat poverty from this angle is that if poor people have access to lawyers, they can get justice in the courts. So I think that's a great way to kind of sort of differentiate that from just sort of like, oh, well, my friend's dad is a lawyer and he helped me out, with a will or something like that. And there's nothing to denigrate that. I mean, that's incredibly important. But legal services is definitely, is definitely a different thing. So So when you got here in 1980, give us a bit of a lay of the land of what like the legal needs of low income communities were when you got here in Charlotte.
Well, I started here in the spring of 1988.
Okay.
And like many legal services programs, we had public benefits practice. People applying for Social Security benefits, supplemental security income, food stamps, what was then aid for families with dependent children, now work first family assistance. And some of it was just individual appeals. You got the facts of this person's case wrong, but a lot of it was making the agencies follow their own rules.
Gotcha.
Follow the rules in the federal legislation and the federal funding and in the state legislation that people were entitled to have decisions about their applications made based on facts of their case, according to the rules. And we did a lot of work around that, and a lot of it was systemic advocacy to make the agencies accept applications and process them according to timelines and make determinations according to the written rules and give people fair hearings when there were disputes about facts and things like that. And some of them were huge. I mean, we had a case that had already started when I was here involving the Social Security Administration not following court precedent on how to evaluate pain as a part of a disabling condition.
Okay.
It seems sort of abstract, but the agency just wasn't following the law. And after multiple individual cases, a class action was filed with a private law firm working with us, and we made the government redo about 150,000 Social Security disability claims.
That's fantastic.
So,
I mean
that they had processed, not following their own rules.
And I think that's important for the audience to know about this, because you mentioned it. You talked about systemic advocacy, because I think that most law firms, some engage in some sort of systemic advocacy, others very much focus on a client by client basis. But I think one of the benefits of having a strong legal services program is that it can utilize things such as a class action suit to really force powerful governmental agencies, who usually don't listen to individual complaints and usually send you away or put you on hold for a long time. And obviously you get hold of a class action suit that has attorney's fees and all these other things, you might, as a government agency, might start to behave. And I think that's one of the nice things and a great impact of legal services programs, and the one that we've had here, and we have two programs, we'll get into that here in Charlotte, in the Charlotte area, has been serving as a watchdog for those rights that are owed to anybody, but that in particular those who are low income and who clearly rely upon public benefits. I mean, that could be very much the difference between life and death in many respects. I mean, let's be pretty serious here. And so I think that's another differentiation, and it's a great thing to know that there are advocates in our community who are looking at systemic problems, utilizing various lenses, and one obviously is through the litigation lens. That's incredible that you were able to get 150,000 with SSI appeals. Was that?
It was Social Security, disability, and SSI. The
Okay.
disability is the state of the programs.
Okay.
Standard. And some of them are much more mundane. I mean, recently we had a case with our health insurance Navigator program where a family with a small child came to get assistance enrolling in an Affordable Care Act insurance plan. In the process of doing the application, it was clear that the child was eligible for Medicaid and shouldn't be on the insurance program, but should apply for Medicaid. And the way the federal computer works when you do that is that the child's information gets taken and then gets sent to the state agency to process as a Medicaid application. And the people waited a couple of months and never heard from the state agency, and eventually called and were told that they had missed the hearing and that the child's application had been denied. And when we looked into it, it turned out that the notice to them about the child's application didn't have an apartment number on it. So it went to the apartment building and didn't get delivered and got returned to the agency. And we figured out that there was a software glitch from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in Washington to the state agency, and they weren't putting any of the apartment numbers on.
Really?
And so we got the state agency to go back and do a sort and figure out that there were about 450 other people who hadn't got notice and whose children had been denied Medicaid because they didn't show up at a hearing because the apartment number wasn't on the notice, and to reissue the notices and reprocess those applications retroactively, and fix the software problem. So we it's a piece of our work. We had a long running issue with the State Department of Health and Human Services about eligibility of low-income women who are diagnosed with breast cancer for breast cancer treatment through Medicaid, with the agency taking the position initially that the initial diagnosis had to come through a county health department. If they got their initial diagnosis anywhere else, even if they then went to the county health department, that this provision of care for breast cancer through Medicaid, they weren't eligible for it, which is sort of crazy. It's like, because
that's something you got to get taken care of.
The wrong person was the first person to discover this. You got breast cancer. And it took us about 1.5 years, but we persuaded the agency to change their interpretation and to open the program up to all low-income people who had the diagnosis.
So Ken, do you feel like this is, and again, I think this is important for the audience to know, is that but for, having an active, watchdog legal services program, and also folks in the community, which I think is important for all of you to know, if you see, issues and stories that are coming from your communities, definitely share those with legal services, because they can compile that and kind of look and see where the systemic issues and not just the one by one. But my question is, do you find that maybe, and I don't know if it's a factor of legal services having been around for a long time or not, do you find that when you engage a government agency that's kind of doing sort of a systemic sort of malfeasance, or just doing something that's not right, like the thing with the apartment numbers, do you feel like you're able to handle most of those out of court, meaning that you kind of advocate without having to actually file anything, or do you find yourself having to actually either work with a private partner or go to the litigation route, what do you see sort of from that aspect?
Well, I think that we have very good relationships with most of the public, the social service agencies we work with, though we're in a structurally adversarial relationship with them, representing people, appealing their decisions. We're negotiating with them to change their benefits and periodically filing lawsuits. And I think that the answer to that is that we have to periodically litigate to have the leverage to settle, but we mostly settle. And people and the agencies are mostly, very happy to have us come to them early and give them the opportunity to fix it, in a mutually agreed way. Outside of litigation, the litigation it's awful. I mean, it's awful for us. We don't have that much resources, and it takes a huge amount of our resources to do that. But it's that we can and will do it occasionally that gives us the leverage to mostly resolve things in negotiation.
So what would you, so obviously we'll stay here on the public benefits aspect, which is an extremely important aspect. So to the audience who may see on your website that legal services or Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy has attorneys and staff that handle public benefit matters. Could you give some sort of like real concrete examples that maybe if they see their family member or a friend going through that should be something to sort of clue them in that maybe they should come to the offices of legal services to look into?
Well, if people are denied a public service or public benefit by a governmental agency and they think it isn't fair, they ought to call us and tell us about it. We'll screen them and we may say, no, we agree that you're not eligible for this and the decision denying benefits was correct based on what you're telling us. But that's what we do is we will evaluate those cases, and if we think that the agency decision was wrong, we'll represent people and help them with that. And some of them, it's hard to understand the scope of what we do. Let me tell you something else. Veterans.
Yeah.
That veterans who apply for VA benefits, for the most part, aren't eligible unless they have a honorable or not bad conduct discharge.
Really? Okay.
And there are a lot of older veterans, Vietnam era veterans, who engaged in behavior that we would now immediately recognize as post-traumatic stress syndrome behavior. They on leave, they got into a fight and in a bar, they driving drunk, whatever, and they negotiated a bad conduct discharge in lieu of court martial.
Oh,
and those happened just routinely, and that 40 years later disqualifies them from receiving VA health care benefits they need because they still have PTSD. And
that's a double whammy.
A process for retroactively upgrading discharge. And we're one of the very few places that will represent people in discharge upgrade cases. And I'll tell you, a lot of those cases raise racial equity issues just plainly. You can see there are cases you see where you just go through the facts and you say, if this veteran had been white, it would not have played out this way. And that, we go back and we represent them in an application to the service to upgrade the discharge, which then makes them eligible for their veterans benefits, including the medical treatment that they need. That's a really
important thing to know, because obviously, there's so many veterans, obviously we just got out of Afghanistan, there's still, they're talking about another one. So, apparently, we're just going to keep cranking out veterans. And so for those of you out there, who are either, know a veteran, are a veteran, or know someone who, is having trouble with their, getting access to, veteran benefits, legal services would be a good place to go. We'll obviously get the contact information towards the end of the show. Staying on the public benefits, probably one of the biggest public benefits to become an issue in the last, obviously during this era of COVID, is unemployment. And so you told me of some pretty interesting statistics about the applications for unemployment that were filed in 2020 alone. So maybe if you could share with the audience sort of the legal services perspective on unemployment and either pre-COVID or during COVID, either way.
Let me start in the recession of 2008. There was a huge amount of unemployment, and the unemployment benefits are paid out of a trust fund that's paid into in good economic times, so that when you have a down cycle and you have unemployed people, they can get unemployment insurance from the trust fund. And it keeps people from being desperately poor, and it helps the economy because you're putting a little money away in the insurance into the trust fund in bad economic times, then it gets spent in recessions, and it helps get out of the recession. but it exhausted the trust fund, and the state legislature demolished our unemployment program. They cut it by more than half. And since 2013, we have had the worst unemployment insurance program in the nation. The
Wow.
amount of benefits, the duration of benefits, the participation rate. So at the beginning of the pandemic, 9% of unemployed people in North Carolina received unemployment insurance benefits because the eligibility rules are so narrow and so limited. And it's, you know, it's if it was a private company, you wouldn't let them call it insurance if only 9% of the people who suffered the injury got any benefits. So we went into the recession with this, into the COVID, into the pandemic, with this terrible unemployment insurance program. And in the spring and summer of 2020, 100,000 people in Mecklenburg County applied for unemployment insurance.
Wow.
And the federal Coronavirus Relief Act created 3 new unemployment programs that were entirely federal to put on top of the state program. And the governor changed the terms of the state program under his emergency authority. And the agency, which operates with an inadequate staff and a really old computer system, couldn't manage the explosion of claims. They couldn't get through on the phone. They tried to file online applications, and the computer would get halfway through and then kick them out, and they couldn't get back in. And we set up a project, hotline with some, we assigned some permanent staff and brought in some temporary staff and volunteers. We had 6 people answering the phone, just helping people get through to get their unemployment insurance claims filed. We worked with the agency to fix it, to get everybody in. And, you know, it's like, I mean, you see these pictures of a snake eating a cow. You know, this 100,000 people went through the unemployment system.
Wow.
And all the federal programs have expired.
Yeah.
And now there is a flood of the computer telling people that they were overpaid and that they have to give money back, or that they're no longer eligible because of glitches in the state software system. And people are there, you can't get an appeal hearing. You can't get your benefits to continue while the issue is on appeal. And so we're still working with the unemployment program, but it's the state legislature just demolished the program. It's the state unemployment insurance, the level of benefits, the duration of benefits, the narrowness of the eligibility requirements are just inadequate. And they are the worst in the country.
Wow. Man, you know, I mean, that's got to be intense, because you think about that, you know, I mean, you know, this is, you lost your job, and through, obviously with the pandemic, through no fault of your own, and it doesn't matter. And honestly, in my opinion, it matters with the fault. I mean, you need resources, you need to live. You know, this is serious. This is serious business here.
Right.
So I mean, so right now, have you seen any? I mean, has the state at least tried to at least improve? I mean, because everybody got CARES money. I mean, has they at least tried to improve the IT infrastructure so folks can at least not be glitching out on when they file for unemployment?
I think the people of the agency are doing their best. I think it's not working. It's not enough, and there has to be legislative relief. The legislature has to increase resources to the program and expand eligibility and benefits. But let me talk about something else. I mean,
Sure.
You know, we have extensive public benefits, healthcare access work. We can talk about Medicaid and the managed care transformation that the state's just gone through. We can talk about consumer protection, housing, but I want to talk about immigration.
Sure.
The Charlotte Immigration Court covers all of North and South Carolina. So anybody who is brought before the court for removal, for deportation, in North or South Carolina has their case heard in Charlotte. And the Charlotte court is tied with Atlanta as the worst court in the country for granting humanitarian relief.
Wow.
So for people who seek asylum, the national approval rate in all the immigration courts in the country around 50%. In the Charlotte court, it's something like 14%. And most of those are kids. So the chance of an adult getting granted asylum in this court is awful. And that is connected to the fact that the proportion of people in the court, the respondents, who are represented is lower in North Carolina than any other state in the country. So fewer people are represented. And our lawyers who practice in that court and the private lawyers who practice in that court say anecdotally, I mean, I don't have data on this, but that they have never seen a single unrepresented person receive asylum in our court.
No, I mean, it's just
so we do work in that court. We don't do enough. We don't have enough resources to represent a very large proportion of the people in that court. We represent a lot of the kids, who are mostly the unaccompanied kids who walk from Central America across Mexico and present themselves at the Texas border, and they can get placed with a custodian in this area. But we're working to represent more of the adults who we think qualify for humanitarian relief, but it's a very complicated presentation, and it's really almost impossible to do if you're not represented by a lawyer.
That's really sad. I think when I think back to my time at the law school, we had Fernando Nunez, who was running the we had a very small immigration clinic, and the students. I mean, again, it's a it's a little bit they would definitely represent undocumented people facing removal, but obviously it sounds like it's gotten worse. Has there ever been I know, like, obviously we can touch on the civil Gideon aspect, but has there ever been kind of like a movement to try to provide like a Gideon kind of like a access, like sort of as a right?
Absolutely. There's a national movement for right to counsel in civil matters that is general, but also for very specific kinds of work. If you're charged with a crime and the possible sentence for what you're charged with is 3 months or more, under Gideon, you're entitled to an appointed lawyer. But in civil matters, there's no right to an appointment of a lawyer, even in cases where you're going to lose your livelihood, you're going to lose your children, you're going to lose really important things in your life. So our agency is as much resources as we can raise in the community. That's how much services we can provide, but the people we represent aren't entitled to representation. There's a big movement for right to counsel in eviction defense cases. There's a big movement in immigration court as well, and we're actually a part of that, and are trying. Have asked the city of Charlotte for funding to help us begin to be a part of a right to counsel movement in the immigration court.
That's really key. I mean, because I think that this is you think of the issues of like fundamental due process, and the idea that and particularly most of the folks who are probably in there, English is probably not even an actual language, or at least if it is, it's a second or a tertiary language for them. And to be able to have to face, some judge or some adjudicator and in a form, it's really, there's something like a fundamental unfairness about that. I think that as a human that you would, kind of, see like the unjustness of something like that.
These are families, they're families, and very often these families, there are members of the families who are citizens, and there are members who are permanent residents, and there are members who have temporary visas, and there are members who may be undocumented. And when you deport somebody or breaking up a family.
Hmm.
And we have laws that provide humanitarian relief that
Hmm.
are just not honored in the immigration courts, and people need to be represented so that that can happen
Because
better.
they could be
There was
returned to a country where their life could be made virtually in danger. Because obviously you're here because a lot of folks are coming because conditions in their home countries are just like terrible. And so, in some respects, would you say that when an immigration court, rejects a humanitarian appeal, not any, that person who, I guess, who loses such appeal or loses such a case is facing serious harm when they return.
many of the many of the people who are deported back to serious risk. Most of our clients have family members in their home country who have been murdered.
Mm.
Um, Parents, siblings, aunts and uncles in gang violence and domestic violence, in drug-related crimes, and they went through the incredible hazard of making it to the American border,
Hmm.
um, out of a huge amount of fear and danger, and not on a whim or just for economic opportunity.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, when you see when they talk about the quote children at the border, it's unaccompanied minors. I mean, you don't just have unaccompanied minors out of nowhere. There's definitely something very serious, that's leading to that. No parents just going to be like, just put their kid by themselves, on the border of some strange, country or something. So, I think that I like this. I like the fact that we're trying to move towards, a right to counsel in these immigration cases. Obviously, one of the biggest, and you had mentioned it earlier, a right to counsel in eviction, in addition to obviously jobs and unemployment. Obviously, one of the biggest issues during the pandemic. Well, it's been a huge issue in Charlotte. You don't even need the Chetty study to talk about this. Is housing, and so maybe you could kind of talk about what has legal services, because there was a quote eviction moratorium that was put in, and then it was challenged, and I think one of the Congress people from St. Louis tried to push it back, but then it faded out. For the audience, could you talk a little bit about what has been housing defense work look like during this pandemic phase, during this pandemic era for legal services programs?
Well, um, so we do a lot. We do some of the eviction defense work, a lot of foreclosure prevention work. Our partner agency, Legal Aid of North Carolina, also does a lot of the eviction work. In evictions during the moratorium only applied to people who were being evicted for non-payment of rent when their income was interrupted by the pandemic. And so it wasn't a blanket
Mm-hmm.
prohibition on evictions, and there were a lot of evictions that were filed that were ostensibly for things other than non-payment of rent, even though non-payment of rent may have been the real reason. And there were so there were a lot of struggles, and a lot of that has been complicated by the fact that landlords for the most part can't they need revenue, and the CARES Act, the various pandemic acts, provided large amounts of cash.
Mm-hmm.
And Mecklenburg County has had one of the very best systems for providing cash to the tenants who can't pay their rent because of the pandemic, so that the landlords can collect their rent. And it's worked much better here than in lots of places in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I credit the county government for that, and Dream Key Partners, which is their key, which full disclosure, I'm on the board of,
Mm-hmm.
for managing that program. But the um, but evictions, this doesn't go away. The moratoriums are over. The courts are scheduling, I think, 350 eviction hearings per week are scheduled in the Mecklenburg County courts, and people are getting evicted. a lot of the evictions were forestalled because of the federal relief money, so
Mhm.
that the landlords did get paid. I mean, they may not have got paid timely,
Right.
and that may have been a problem for them, but they, for the most part, have gotten paid. What's now happening, for reasons that are partly due to the pandemic and partly due to just the growth and of the affluent community in Charlotte, is the rents have gone up like 20 or
Yeah.
30% over the last few years. And that most of the people in service industries and blue collar work um, can't afford it. And
Hmm.
so, there's just not enough housing and
Yeah.
not enough affordable housing. And there are a lot of efforts to address that, but they're not enough. And that something's going to happen, or there just aren't going to be places that people can afford to rent in Mecklenburg County. A lot of people are moving further away, which
Hmm.
creates transportation needs that are difficult. And also, with homeowners, there are a lot of people who own their homes and whose incomes were interrupted because of the pandemic, and who have foreclosure challenges,
Mm.
just like the tenants do with eviction challenges. And we've been representing a lot of them and trying to get the federal relief money to the lenders in a way that allows people to stay in their houses and not have those houses turn over in this difficult housing market. And then the homeowners don't have enough money to buy new houses, and they're in the rental market, which is a mess. Um, so we're doing a lot of that work.
Hmm.
Uh,
No, I mean, I think, Charlotte, I think if anything, in some of our prior episodes, and we've dealt with, talking about lack affordable housing with the Charlotte Housing Coalition, the 2040 plan. I mean, it kind of, there's 400,000 people who are moving to this area over the next 20 years. And that's going to obviously put a pressure on how the need for actual physical housing. But then, of course, we're already seeing it that everything, the prices are going higher and higher, and and I don't know what's the status of subsidy. I mean, I know that they have, because it's been a while since I really tracked this, but have they issued more vouchers? Have they issued more, at least more support from the federal level?
there are not more federal vouchers. There are local vouchers. I mean, I think
Okay.
this is also very unique about this community, that there was a private fundraising effort, A Way Home, Foundation for the Carolinas, the city and the county chipped in big time, and there's a $20 million endowment that supports housing vouchers for low-income people that are like the Section 8 federal vouchers, but it's
Really?
all private local money managed by a private nonprofit in Charlotte. Um, it's helpful. It's not enough.
Right.
The county is beginning to fund a voucher program. And so there's some local funding, but the scale of these things
Hmm.
is just very difficult to do because housing prices are going up so much, whether it's
It
rent
eats
or
away any subsidy, right? Because if it's, if you're, yeah, I mean, if it's 30%, but then 30% of like 500 versus 1,000 is a huge huge jump in the amount of subsidy that it's eaten away from that amount. Um, yeah, and that is a lot. I think as we're getting closer to the end here, you did mention Legal Aid of North Carolina as a partner, and I think probably one of the questions that is kind of common in the community is, you're located typically in the same building, and of course we're going to talk about this new building as well. What's the difference between Legal Aid in North Carolina and Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy?
Legal Aid of North Carolina is funded by the Federal Legal Services Corporation, which is the successor to the OEO Legal Services Program that we were funded by until 2002. In 1996, Congress changed the rules for Legal Services Corporation funding to prohibit agencies that receive the funding from doing many forms of systemic advocacy, such as class action litigation and legislative lobbying, and negotiating with public agencies to get them to change their rules. and also prohibited the agencies that received the funding from representing disfavored groups, particularly immigrants,
Right.
people who were incarcerated, people who were accused of drug offenses. And our agency, we reorganized the state legal services system in 2002, created Legal Aid of North Carolina to be the sole recipient of the LSC funds. And the agency that I work for, which was then called Legal Services of Southern Piedmont, and is now called Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, gave up its LSC funding so it could do the work representing the immigrants and do the systemic advocacy. And we work in very close partnership with the Charlotte office of Legal Aid of North Carolina, which until a week ago was our tenant on Elizabeth Avenue. And starting next week is in an adjoining building in our new facility on Albemarle Road that we have spent 3 years raising private money to buy and renovate. And so we have a new office which has adequate facilities for us to effectively represent clients, confidential meeting rooms, rooms for client education events, and pro bono clinics to serve clients and things like that. But we have this newly renovated building on at 5535 Albemarle Road, which is right near the old Eastland Mall site, and accessible by bus and by car. And Legal Aid is in the adjoining building.
So are all of you? So this building, this new headquarters is operational now. So you're not in transition. You're there now.
Monday. We're in the middle of the move.
Wow.
We're in the middle of the move, and we have workmen doing the punch list of the renovation. But Monday it will be. Now we're still operating according to COVID rules. So we rotate our staff through. Only about a third of our staff is in the building at any one time.
Okay.
Everybody's wearing masks. Our staff has all been vaccinated. The protocols for seeing clients are protective. If the clients don't have masks when they come, we give them N95 masks. So it's but we will be operating from the new building starting on Monday.
Well, first of all, congratulations on, the new building. And I think if there's, obviously there are many takeaways, from this episode, but one of the huge ones is tell everybody that, who is out there, that legal services will no longer be on Elizabeth. I think that's been kind of, people have known that vicinity, but you did say that it is accessible, will be accessible off of the eventual trolley line that's going to get out there, and then of course it's on every bus line and the such as well, because this is a big opportunity. But definitely we want to let people know, and I hope the library can help out with spreading the word of the new location of Legal Aid and Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, because I think that what they can do, and they can do for the community. And I think it's important that people know that they are in a new location, got a new business location, and moved on up, which is great, because you've got more space to be able to really do more more projects. Because I've been in that office for it's almost like those old newsrooms. Everyone's got it's a really kind of compact area there. I think we're now at a point where, we could definitely start to take some questions, and we're kind of close to the end of the hour here. So if for anyone who has been, listening, you feel free to either use the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question about, you can ask me or Ken obviously about what's going on with legal services, or about Ken's storied career as a legal service advocate for so long. And again, it goes without saying, on behalf, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the whole entire Charlotte community, but I can just say that as someone who's been in this community for a little while, your work as as executive director, your work as a legal service attorney for all of your career, or at least your dedication to this it doesn't go without notice. And just want to thank you for all these years of serving this community. How many thousands and millions of people who wouldn't have a, like a shot at something, got a shot at something because of you and Legal Services on Piedmont, now known as Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy.
Thank you.
All right, come on, let's get in. I think Lawrence popped in there. Is that a question, Lawrence, or you got a question? I know you got a question. I know Christy got a question.
Comment.
Yeah, I know Christy always got a question. I know that. All right, Christy, don't let me down here. Maybe she's not by her off. Okay.
Well, I have a question. What are the plans for your successors? When does the job get posted? Are you going to have any?
The job's been posted since December. There's a search committee of the board. They have a pool of applicants, but it's not closed. They're still looking for more applicants, and they will be starting interviews soon. I'm working through the beginning of April, and there will probably be an interim director for a month or two while they recruit and secure a new director. I'm confident the agency's in good shape. The senior staff is fabulous. The younger staff is terrific. It's really it's a great place to work.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few folks who are in my clinic who like Brandy Haynes and some other folks, Cassidy Estes, went over from Charlotte Law when I was a teacher over there, and they've, gone to do some good work with, I don't know which one they're with, either at CCLA or, yeah. Okay. I knew that because I knew they go in that building. I know that.
Cassidy is a senior lawyer in our family support and healthcare program. She does public benefits work. She's terrific. Brandy is terrific. She's a new mother.
Yeah.
Working part-time with us on criminal records expunctions and driver's license restoration cases.
Yeah, it's just great to see. And I think even though he's at the other program, Isaac Sturgill, he's over doing a lot of. I saw him on the web. I actually had a eviction case. It was more on a commercial property, but I saw Isaac's name there. He was handling a lot of cases for lay on the WebEx calendar call for appeals from from the magistrate court. So it's good to see some of the folks from Charlotte Law doing good work. Right now, you got a good opportunity to ask a question right now, so you can use the chat or unmute yourself and just jump in.
Quick question. I gather that immigration is pretty close to your heart. And you mentioned earlier about how distressing it's been as far as what you've been seeing, particularly in recent times. What can be done, or what are some of the things that you can imagine that needs to be done to really improve the situation that you had just talked about earlier?
Well, one thing I will say is that courts get better when people are represented. And, I'll tell you, 30 years ago, when I started here in magistrates court, the magistrates would reflexively grant relief to landlords without really looking at a case unless there was a lawyer there. And because we were in that court so many times representing people, the magistrates really learned about tenants' rights. And now, if you were in landlord-tenant court, a tenant who isn't represented gets better treatment than they would have before. And I think that in immigration court, because there's so few people being represented, there's no feedback loop to the judges for just ordering everybody deported. And that if there's representation and there is appeals of cases, and cases get sent back, reversed by the appellate court, then the judges will get better. And so having more people represented in immigration court will help people represented. It'll help the others too. And so just building capacity to be able to do that. We have recent funding from the Hispanic Federation, some of which comes from the Charlotte Mecklenburg Community Foundation, which is a part of Foundation for the Carolinas. We have some new money from the state bar to do immigration work. And as I said before, we're asking the city to provide some funding to do that. But just being able to represent more people is one key.
Well, I got a question for you, Ken. You mentioned in your backstory that you had spent time as a labor, either organizer or labor attorney.
Attorney.
Because as you kind of scan the body politic, I remember I just saw in the news that I guess it was a Starbucks in Buffalo had organized and they actually formed a union. And so it's maybe, and I saw something that now 50 Starbucks have now started to try to form a union in their own shop. Do you see legal services possibly, I mean, again, depending on funding and things, of being more involved with growing sort of unionization of places like Starbucks or McDonald's or something like that?
I don't see our agency or legal services generally as representing unions. I think that, we're trying to enhance our employment law practice. We have a new fellow through through
EJW
Legal Justice Works, who's focusing on wage theft. I mean, there's a huge amount of wage theft in service industries. It's just factually true that wages are better when the rate of unionization is higher, and not just in the unionized employers. That the higher rate of unionization increases the wages of the entire workforce. And I, one of the things about we work against the background of the larger economy. And over 30 years, the basic income of lower income people has hardly changed, but the costs have changed hugely. Absolutely. The cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, and you can't expect to have those dynamics in the larger society without it ripping apart the ability of people to afford to live decent lives, to meet their basic needs. And so, I'm hopeful that efforts to increase unions will increase the general economic ability of lower wage workers to meet their needs, and that'll affect our work. In that regard, let me just say child tax credits.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you this question. That's what
has been around for years, not fully refundable and at a low rate. And during COVID, it was made fully refundable and raised to $300 a month and paid monthly. That decreased child poverty in the United States by about 50%. We have the worst child poverty rate of any industrialized country in the world, and we cut it in half with one program. And we have now let that program expire. In December, in January, it went back to the old formula, not fully refundable, not paid monthly, lower level, and doubled our child poverty rate again. We have the ability to end poverty. We really do. We just have to choose to do it.
I hear you. No, I mean, I think that, there's like a saying, we have enough for our need. We just don't have enough for our greed. And I think, that's the old legal aid attorney. I'm out of there, but you can't get that guy out of me. I mean, it's, and I think that, again, Ken, and to Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, thank you for fighting the good fight all these years for all of us here. Obviously I want to make a plug. I mean, Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy is a 501c3 public charity. You can get a tax deductible donation. So I think there's a link in the chat to it, but I'm sure they got to donate now. I'm sure that, any of your, donations do go to support these programs that, again, are helping to keep, helping to defend undocumented people who don't have representation in immigration court, helping to represent, folks who are facing the loss of housing or the loss of public benefits, helping veterans access health care. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and so, right now, our best tool right now is through programs like Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy. So we're about ready to wrap up, but if there are any other questions, comments, or anything before we bid adieu to Ken and Ken, what are we? I mean, you're going to stay here in Charlotte. Can we still at least see you walking around?
I got no plans to leave.
Okay, all right. You're not going to Hawaii or nothing. Okay, good. All right. Well, Ken, thank you again so much for all of your service, and again, thank everybody in our audience for joining us on a Friday for Fridays with Rocky, and again, everyone have a great weekend. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.